Chapter 127 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. The Wonderful Mallet. Once upon a time there were two brothers. The elder was an honest and good man, but he was very poor, while the younger, who was dishonest and stingy, had managed to pile up a large fortune. The name of the elder was Cain, and that of the younger was Cho. Now one day Cain went to Cho's house, and begged for the loan of some seed rice and some silkworm eggs, for last season had been unfortunate, and he was in want of both. Cho had plenty of good rice and excellent silkworm eggs, but he was such a miser that he did not want to lend them. At the same time he felt ashamed to refuse his brother's request, so he gave him some worm-eaten musty rice and some dead eggs, which he felt sure would never hatch. Cain, never suspecting that his brother would play him such a shabby trick, put plenty of mulberry leaves with the eggs, to be food for the silkworms when they should appear. Appear they did, and throve and grew wonderfully, much better than those of the stingy brother, who was angry and jealous when he heard of it. Going to Cain's house one day and finding his brother was out, Cho took a knife and killed all the silkworms, cutting each poor little creature in two. Then he went home without having been seen by anybody. When Cain came home, he was dismayed to find his silkworms in this state, but he did not suspect who had done him this bad trick, and tried to feed them with mulberry leaves as before. The silkworms came to life again, and doubled the number, for now each half was a living worm. They grew and throve, and the silk they spun was twice as much as Cain had expected. So now he began to prosper. The envious Cho, seeing all this, cut all his own silkworms in half, but alas! they did not come to life again, so he lost a great deal of money, and became more jealous than ever. Cain also planted the rice seed which he had borrowed from his brother, and it sprang up, and grew and flourished far better than Cho's had done. The rice ripened well, and he was just intending to cut and harvest it, when a flight of 1,000 upon thousands of swallows came and began to devour it. Cain was much astonished, and shouted and made as much noise as he could in order to drive them away. They flew away, indeed, but came back immediately, so that he kept driving them away, and they kept flying back again. At last he pursued them into a distant field, where he lost sight of them. He was by this time so hot and tired that he sat down to rest. By little and little his eyes closed, his head dropped away upon a mossy bank, and he fell fast asleep. Then he dreamed that a merry band of children came into the field, laughing and shouting. They sat down upon the ground in a ring, and one who seemed the eldest, a boy of 14 or 15, came close to the bank on which he lay asleep, and raising a big stone near his head, drew from under it a small wooden mallet. Then in his dream Cain saw this big boy stand in the middle of the ring with the mallet in his hand, and asked the children each in turn, "What would you like the mallet to bring you?" The first child answered, "A kite." The big boy shook the mallet, upon which appeared immediately a fine kite with tail and string, all complete. The next cried, "A battledore." Out sprang a splendid battledore and a shower of shuttlecocks. Then a little girl shyly whispered, "A doll." The mallet was shaken, and there stood a beautifully dressed doll. "I should like all the fairy tale books that have ever been written in the whole world," said a bright-eyed, intelligent maiden, and no sooner had she spoken than piles upon piles of beautiful books appeared, And so at last the wishes of all the children were granted, and they stayed a long time in the field with the things that the Mallet had given them. At last they got tired, and prepared to go home, the big boy first carefully hiding the Mallet under the stone from whence he had taken it. Then all the children went away. Presently Cain awoke, and gradually remembered his dream. In preparing to rise he turned around, and there, close to where his head had lain, was the big stone he had seen in his dream. How strange, he thought. Expecting he hardly knew what, he raised the stone, and there lay the Mallet. He took it home with him, and following the example of the children he had seen in his dream, shook it, at the same time calling out "gold," or "rice," "silk," or "sake." Whatever he called for immediately flew out of the Mallet, so that he could have everything he wanted, and as much of it as he liked. Cain being now a rich and prosperous man, Cho was of course jealous of him, and determined to find a magic Mallet which would do as much for him. He came therefore to Cain and borrowed seed rice, which he planted and tended with care, being impatient for it to grow and ripen soon. It grew well and ripened soon, and now Cho watched daily for the swallows to appear; and to be sure, one day a flight of swallows came and began to eat up the rice. Cho was delighted at this, and drove them away, pursuing them to the distant field, where Cain had followed them before. There he lay down, intending to go to sleep as his brother had done, but the more he tried to go to sleep the wider awake he seemed. Presently the band of children came skipping and jumping, so he shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep, but all the time watched anxiously what the children would do. They sat down in a ring, as before, and the big boy came close to Cho's head and lifted the stone. He put down his hand to lift the Mallet, but no Mallet was there. One of the children said, "Perhaps that lazy old farmer has taken our Mallet." So the big boy laid hold of Cho's nose, which was rather long, and gave it a good pinch, and all the other children ran up and pinched and pulled his nose, and the nose itself got longer and longer. First it hung down to his chin, then over his chest, next down to his knees, and at last to his very feet. It was in vain that Cho protested his innocence. The children pinched and pummeled him to their hearts' content, then capered round him, shouting and laughing, and making game of him, and so at last went away. Now Cho was left alone, a sad and angry man. Holding his long nose painfully in both hands, he slowly took his way toward his brother Cain's house. Here he related all that had happened to him from the very day when he had behaved so badly about the seed rice and silkworm eggs. He humbly begged his brother to pardon him, and if possible do something to restore his unfortunate nose to its proper size. The kind-hearted Cain pitied him, and said, "You have been dishonest and mean, and selfish and envious, and that is why you have got this punishment. If you promise to behave better for the future, I will try what can be done." So saying, he took the Mallet and rubbed Cho's nose with it gently, and the nose gradually became shorter and shorter, until at last it came back to its proper shape and size. But ever after, if at any time Cho felt inclined to be selfish and dishonest, as he did now and then, his nose began to smart and burn, and he fancied he felt it beginning to grow. So great was his terror of having a long nose again that these symptoms never failed to bring him back to his good behavior. End of chapter 127. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 128 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 128. The Tongue-Cut Sparrow. Once upon a time, a cross old woman laid some starch in a basin, intending to put it in the clothes in her wash-tub. But a sparrow that a woman, her neighbor, kept as a pet, ate it up. Seeing this, the cross old woman seized the sparrow and, saying, "You hateful thing," cut its tongue and let it go. When the neighbor woman heard that her pet sparrow had got its tongue cut for this offense, she was greatly grieved, and set out with her husband over mountains and plains to find where it had gone, crying, "Where does the tongue-cut sparrow stay? Where does the tongue-cut sparrow stay?" At last they found its home. When the sparrow saw that its old master and mistress had come to see it, it rejoiced and brought them into its house and thanked them for their kindness in old times. It spread a table for them and loaded it with sake and fish till there was no more room, and made its wife and children and grandchildren all serve the table. At last, throwing away its drinking cup, it danced a jig called the Sparrow's Dance, and thus they spent the day. When it began to grow dark and there was talk of going home, the sparrow brought out 2 wicker baskets and said, "Will you take the heavy one, or shall I give you the light one?" The old people replied, "We are old, so give us the light one. It will be easier to carry it." The sparrow then gave them the light basket, and they returned with it to their home. "Let us open it and see what is in it," they said. And when they opened it and looked, they found gold and silver and jewels and rolls of silk. They never expected anything like this. The more they took out, the more they found inside. The supply was inexhaustible, so that the house at once became rich and prosperous. When the cross old woman who had cut the sparrow's tongue saw this, she was filled with envy, and went and asked her neighbor where the sparrow lived, and all about the way. "I will go too," she said, and at once set out on her search. Again the sparrow brought out 2 wicker baskets, and asked as before, "Will you take the heavy one, or shall I give you the light one?" Thinking the treasure would be great in proportion to the weight of the basket, the old woman replied, "Let me have the heavy one." Receiving this, she started home with it on her back, the sparrows laughing at her as she went. It was as heavy as a stone and hard to carry, but at last she got back with it to her house. Then, when she took off the lid and looked in, a whole troop of frightful creatures came bouncing out from the inside, and at once they caught her up and flew away with her. End of Chapter 128. The Tongue-Cut Sparrow. Chapter 129 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 129. Battle of the Monkey and the Crab. A monkey and a crab once met when going round a mountain. The monkey had picked up a persimmon seed, and the crab had a piece of toasted rice cake. The monkey, seeing this, and wishing to get something that could be turned to a good account at once, said, "Pray exchange that rice cake for this persimmon seed." The crab, without a word, gave up his cake, and took the persimmon seed, and planted it. At once it sprang up, and soon became a tree so high that one had to look far up to see it. The tree was full of persimmons, but the crab had no means of climbing it, so he asked the monkey to scramble up and get the fruit for him. The monkey got up on a limb of the tree and began to eat the persimmons. The unripe ones he threw at the crab, but all the ripe and good ones he put in his pouch. The crab under the tree thus got his shell badly bruised, and only by good luck escaped into his hole, where he lay distressed with pain and not able to get up. Now when the relatives of the household of the crab heard how matters stood, they were surprised and angry, and declared war, and attacked the monkey, who, leading forth a numerous following, bade defiance to the other party. The crabs, finding themselves unable to meet and cope with this force, became still more exasperated and enraged, and retreated into their hole and held a council of war. Then came a rice mortar, a pestle, a bee, and an egg, and together they devised a deep-laid plot to be avenged. First they requested that peace be made with the crabs, and thus they induced the king of the monkeys to enter their hole unattended, and seated him on the hearth. The monkey, not suspecting any plot, took the hibachi, or poker, to stir up the slumbering fire, when bang went the egg that was lying hidden in the ashes, and burned the monkey's arm. Surprised and alarmed, he plunged his arm into the pickling tub in the kitchen to relieve the pain of the burn. Then the bee, which was hidden near the tub, stung him sharply in the face, already wet with tears. Without waiting to brush off the bee, and howling bitterly, he rushed for the back door, but just then some seaweed entangled his legs and made him slip. Then down came the pestle, tumbling on him from the shelf, and the mortar too came rolling down on him from the roof of the porch, and broke his back, and so weakened him that he was unable to rise up. Then out came the crabs in a crowd, and brandishing on high their pincers, they pinched the monkey so sorely that he begged them for forgiveness, and promised never to repeat his meanness and treachery. End of chapter 129. The Battle of the Monkey and the Crab.
Chapter 130 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. The Cub's Triumph. Once upon a time there lived in a forest a badger and a mother fox with one little cub. There were no other beasts in the wood, because the hunters had killed them all with bows and arrows, or by setting snares. The deer and the wild boar, the hares, the weasels, and the stoats, even the bright little squirrels, had been shot, or had fallen into traps. At last, only the badger and the fox, with her young one, were left, and they were starving, for they dared not venture from their holes for fear of the traps. They did not know what to do or where to turn for food. At last the badger said, "I have thought of a plan. I will pretend to be dead. You must change yourself into a man, and take me into the town and sell me. With the money you get for me, you must buy food and bring it into the forest. When I get a chance I will run away and come back to you, and we will eat our dinner together. Mind you wait for me, and don't eat any of it until I come. Next week it will be your turn to be dead, and my turn to sell. Do you see?" The fox thought this plan would do very well. So as soon as the badger had laid down and pretended to be dead, she said to her little cub, "Be sure not to come out of the hole until I come back. Be very good and quiet, and I will soon bring you some nice dinner." She then changed herself into a woodcutter, took the badger by the heels and swung him over her shoulders, and trudged off into the town. There she sold the badger for a fair price, and with the money bought some fish, some tofu, (Footnote: Curd made from white beans.) And some vegetables. She then ran back to the forest as fast as she could, changed herself into a fox again, and crept into her hole to see if little cub was all right. Little cub was there, safe enough, but very hungry, and wanted to begin upon the tofu at once. "No, no," said the mother fox, "fair play a jewel. We must wait for the badger." Soon the badger arrived, quite out of breath with running so fast. "I hope you haven't been eating any of the dinner," he panted.
I could not get away sooner. The man you sold me to brought his wife to look at me, and boasted how cheap he had bought me. You should have asked twice as much. At last they left me alone, and then I jumped up and ran away as fast as I could." The badger, the fox, and the cub now sat down to dinner, and had a fine feast, the badger taking care to get the best bits for himself. Some days after, when all the food was finished, they had begun to get hungry again. The badger said to the fox, "Now it's your turn to die." So the fox pretended to be dead, and the badger changed himself into a hunter, shouldered the fox, and went off to the town, where he made a good bargain, and sold her for a nice little sum of money. You have already seen that the badger was greedy and selfish. What do you think he did now? He wished to have all the money, and all the food it would buy for himself, so he whispered to the man who had bought the fox, "That fox is only pretending to be dead. Take care he doesn't run away." "We'll soon settle that," said the man, as he knocked the fox on the head with a big stick, and killed her. The badger next laid out the money in buying all the nice things he could think of. He carried them off to the forest, and there ate them all up himself, without giving one bit to the poor little cub, who was all alone crying for its mother, very sad and very hungry. Poor little motherless cub! But being a clever little fox, he soon began to put two and two together, and at least felt quite sure that the badger had, in some way, caused the loss of his mother. He made up his mind that he would punish the badger, and as he was not big enough or strong enough to do it by force, he was obliged to try another plan. He did not let the badger see how angry he was with him, but said in a friendly way, "Let us have a game of changing ourselves into men. If you can change yourself so cleverly that I cannot find you out, you will have won the game; but if I change myself so that you cannot find me out, then I shall have won the game. I will begin, if you like, and you may be sure I shall turn myself into somebody very grand while I am about it." The badger agreed. So then, instead of changing himself at all, the cunning little cub just went and hid himself behind a tree, and watched to see what would happen. Presently there came along the bridge leading into the town a nobleman, seated in a sedan chair, a great crowd of servants and men at arms following him. The badger was quite sure that this must be the fox, so he ran up to the sedan chair, put in his head, and cried, "I found you out! I've won the game!" "A badger! A badger! Off with his head!" cried the nobleman. So one of the retainers cut off the badger's head with one blow of his sharp sword, the little cub all the time laughing unseen behind the tree. End of chapter 130. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 131 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chapter 131. The Silly Jellyfish. Once upon a time, the king of dragons, who had till then lived as a bachelor, took it into his head to get married. His bride was a young dragonette just 16 years old, lovely enough, in very sooth, to become the wife of a king. Great were the rejoicings on the occasion. The fishes, both great and small, came to pay their respects and to offer gifts to the newly wedded pair, and for some days all was feasting and merriment. But alas, even dragons have their trials. Before a month had passed, the young dragon queen fell ill. The doctors dosed her with every medicine that was known to them, but all to no purpose. At last they shook their heads and declared that there was nothing more to be done. The illness must take its course, and she would probably die. But the sick queen said to her husband, "I know something that will cure me. Only fetch me a live monkey's liver to eat, and I shall get well at once." "A live monkey's liver!" exclaimed the king. "What are you thinking of, my dear? Why, you forget that we dragons live in the sea, while monkeys live far away from here, among the forest trees on land. A monkey's liver? Why, darling, you must be mad." Hereupon the young dragon queen burst into tears. "I only ask you for one small thing," whimpered she, "and you won't get it for me. I always thought you didn't really love me. Oh, I wish I had stayed at home with my mamma and my papa." Here her voice choked with sobs, and she could say no more. Well, of course the Dragon King did not like to have it thought that he was unkind to his beautiful young wife, so he sent for his trusty servant, the jellyfish, and said, "It is a rather difficult job, but what I want you to try to do is to swim across to the land and persuade a live monkey to come here with you. In order to make the monkey willing to come, you can tell him how much nicer everything is here in Dragonland than away where he lives. But what I really want him for is to cut out his liver and use it as medicine for your young mistress, who, as you know, is dangerously ill." So the jellyfish went off on his strange errand. In those days he was just like any other fish, with eyes and fins and a tail. He even had little feet, which made him able to walk on the land as well as to swim in the water. It did not take him many hours to swim across to the country where the monkeys lived, and, fortunately, there just happened to be a fine monkey skipping about among the branches of the trees near the place where he landed. So the jellyfish said, "Mr. Monkey, I have come to tell you of the country far more beautiful than this. It lies beyond the waves, and it is called Dragonland. There is pleasant weather there all the year round. There is always plenty of ripe fruit on the trees, and there are none of those mischievous creatures you call men. If you will come with me, I will take you there. Just get on my back." The monkey thought it would be fun to see a new country, so he leapt on the jellyfish's back, and off they started across the water. But when they had gone about halfway, he began to fear that perhaps there might be some hidden danger, for it seemed so odd to be fetched suddenly in that way by a stranger. So he said to the jellyfish, "What made you think of coming to me?" The jellyfish answered, "My master, the king of dragons, wants you in order to cut out your liver and make it as medicine for his wife, the queen, who is sick." "Oh, that's your little game, is it?" thought the monkey. But he kept his thoughts to himself, and only said, "Nothing would please me better than to be of service to their majesties, but it so happens that I left my liver hanging to a branch of a big chestnut tree where you found me skipping about. A liver is a thing that weighs a good deal, so I generally take it out and play about without it during the daytime. We must go back for it." The jellyfish agreed that there was nothing else that could be done under the circumstances, for, silly creature that he was, he did not see that the monkey was telling a story in order to avoid getting killed and having his liver used as medicine for the fanciful young dragon queen. When they reached the shore of the monkey land again, the monkey bounded off the jellyfish's back and up to the topmost branch of the chestnut tree in less than no time. Then he said, "I do not see my liver here. Perhaps someone has taken it away, but I will look for it. You, meantime, had better go back and tell your master what has happened. He might be anxious about you if you do not come home before dark." So the jellyfish started off a second time, and when he got home he told the Dragon King everything, just as it had happened. But the king flew into a passion with him for his stupidity, and halloed to his officers, saying, "Away with this fellow! Take him and beat him to a jelly." Don't let a single bone remain unbroken in his body." So the officers seized him and beat him as the king had commanded. That is the reason why, to this very day, jellyfishes have no bones, but are just nothing more than a mass of pulp. As for the Dragon Queen, when she found she could not have the monkey's liver, why, she made up her mind that the only thing to do was to get well without it. End of chapter 131. The Silly Jellyfish.
Chapter 132 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chin Chin Kobamama. Once there was a little girl who was very pretty, but also very lazy. Her parents were rich, and had a great many servants, and these servants were very fond of the little girl, and did everything for her which she ought to have been able to do for herself. Perhaps this was what made her so lazy. When she grew up into a beautiful woman she still remained lazy. But as the servants always dressed and undressed her, and arranged her hair, she looked very charming, and nobody thought about her faults. At last she was married to a brave warrior, and went away with him to live in another house, where there were but few servants. She was sorry not to have as many servants as she had at home, because she was obliged to do several things for herself which other folks had always done for her, and it was a great deal of trouble to her to dress herself, and to take care of her own clothes, and keep herself looking neat and pretty to please her husband. But as he was a warrior, and often had to be far away from home with the army, she could sometimes be just as lazy as she wished, and her husband's parents were very old and good natured, and never scolded her. Well, one night, while her husband was away with the army, she was awakened by a queer little noises in her room. By the light of a big paper lantern she could see very well, and she saw strange things. Hundreds of little men, dressed just like Japanese warriors, but only about 1 inch high, were dancing all around her pillow. They wore the same kind of dress her husband wore on holidays, kamishimo, a long robe with square shoulders, and their hair was tied up in knots, and each wore 2 tiny swords. They all looked at her as they danced and laughed, and they all sang the same song over and over again. Chin Chin Kobamama, Yomo Fuke Soro, Ojimere Hime Gimi, Ya Ton Ton, which meant, "We are the Chin Chin Kobamama. The hour is late. Sleep, honorable noble darling." The words seemed very polite, but she soon saw that the little men were only making cruel fun of her. They also made ugly faces at her. She tried to catch some of them, but they jumped about so quickly that she could not. Then she tried to drive them away, but they would not go, and they never stopped singing Chin Chin Kobamama, and laughing at her. Then she knew they were little fairies, and became so frightened that she could not even cry out. They danced around her until morning. Then they all vanished suddenly. She was ashamed to tell anybody what had happened, because, as she was the wife of a warrior, she did not wish anybody to know how frightened she had been. Next night, again, the little men came and danced, and they came also the night after that, and every night, always at the same hour, which the old Japanese used to call the hour of the ox, that is, about 2 o'clock in the morning by our time. At last she became very sick, through want of sleep and through fright. But the little men would not leave her alone. When her husband came back home he was very sorry to find her sick in bed. At first she was afraid to tell him what made her ill, for fear that he would laugh at her; but he was so kind, and coaxed her so gently, that after a while she told him what happened every night. He did not laugh at her at all, but looked very serious for a time. Then he asked: "At what time do they come?" She answered: "Always at the same hour, the hour of the ox." "Very well," said her husband, "to night I shall hide and watch for them. Do not be frightened." So that night the warrior hid himself in the closet in the sleeping room, and kept watch through a chink between the sliding doors. He waited and watched until the hour of the ox. Then, all at once, the little men came up through the mats, and began their dance and their song: "Chin, chin, Kobamama, Yomo fuke soro." They looked so queer, and danced in such a funny way, that the warrior could scarcely keep from laughing. But he saw his young wife's frightened face, and then, remembering that nearly all Japanese ghosts and goblins are afraid of a sword, he drew his blade and rushed out of the closet and struck at the little dancers. Immediately they all turned into, what do you think? Toothpicks! There were no more little warriors, only a lot of old toothpicks scattered over the mats. The young wife had been too lazy to put her toothpicks away properly, and every day, after having used a new toothpick, she would stick it down between the mats on the floor to get rid of it. So the little fairies who take care of the floor mats became angry with her, and tormented her. Her husband scolded her, and she was so ashamed that she did not know what to do. A servant was called, and the toothpicks were taken away and burned, and after that the little men never came back again. End of chapter 132. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 133 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chapter 133. The Old Woman Who Lost Her Dumplings. Long, long ago there was a funny old woman who liked to laugh and make dumplings of rice flour. One day, while she was preparing some dumplings for dinner, she let one fall, and it rolled into a hole in the earthen floor of her little kitchen and disappeared. The old woman tried to reach it by putting her hand down the hole, and all at once the earth gave way, and the old woman fell in. She fell quite a distance, but was not a bit hurt, and when she got up on her feet again, she saw that she was standing on a road just like the road before her house. It was quite light down there, and she could see plenty of rice fields, but no one in them. How all this happened I cannot tell you, but it seems that the old woman had fallen into another country. The road she had fallen upon sloped very much, so after having looked for her dumpling in vain, she thought that it must have rolled further away down the hill. She ran down the road to look, crying, "My dumpling! My dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" After a little while she saw a stone image standing by the roadside, and she said, calling it by its name, "Oh, Jizo-san, did you see my dumpling?" Jizo answered, "Yes, I saw your dumpling rolling by me down the road. But you had better not go any further, because there is a wicked Oni living down there who eats people." But the old woman only laughed and ran on further down the road, crying, "My dumpling! My dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" And she came to another statue of Jizo, and asked it, "Oh, kind Jizo, did you see my dumpling?" And Jizo said, "Yes, I saw your dumpling go by a little while ago, but you must not run any further, because there is a wicked Oni down there who eats people." But she only laughed and ran on, still crying out, "My dumpling! My dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" And she came to a third Jizō and asked it, "Oh, dear Jizō, did you see my dumpling?" But Jizō said, "Don't talk about your dumpling now. There is an Oni coming. Squat down here behind my sleeve, and don't make any noise." Presently the Oni came very close, and stopped, and bowed to Jizō, and said, "Good day, Jizō-san." Jizō said good day too, very politely. Then the Oni suddenly sniffed the air 2 or 3 times in a suspicious way, and cried out, "Jizō-san, Jizō-san, I smell the smell of mankind somewhere. Don't you?" "Oh," said Jizō, "perhaps you are mistaken." "No, no," said the Oni, after sniffing the air again. "I smell the smell of mankind." Then the old woman could not help laughing, "Tee hee hee!" and the Oni immediately reached down his big hairy hand behind Jizō's sleeve and pulled her out, still laughing, "Hee hee hee!" "Ah, ha!" cried the Oni. Then Jizō said, "What are you going to do with that good old woman? You must not hurt her." "I won't," said the Oni, "but I will take her home with me to cook for us." "Tee hee hee!" laughed the old woman. "Very well," said Jizō, "but you must really be kind to her. If you are not, I shall be very angry." "I won't hurt her at all," promised the Oni, "and she will only have to do a little work for us every day. Good bye, Jizō-san." Then the Oni took the old woman far down the road till they came to a wide river where there was a boat. He put her into the boat and took her across the river to his house. It was a very large house. He led her at once into the kitchen and told her to cook something for dinner for himself and the other Oni who lived with him, and he gave her a small wooden rice paddle and said, "You must always put only 1 grain of rice into the pot, and when you stir that 1 grain of rice in the water with this paddle, the grain will multiply until the pot is full." So the old woman put just 1 grain of rice into the pot, as the Oni told her, and began to stir it with the paddle, and as she stirred, the 1 grain became 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, 32, 64, and so on. Every time she moved the paddle, the rice increased in quantity, and in a few minutes the great pot was full. After that, the funny old woman stayed a long time in the house of the Oni, and every day cooked food for him and for all his friends. The Oni never hurt or frightened her, and her work was made quite easy with the magic paddle, although she had to cook a very, very great quantity of rice, because an Oni eats much more than any human being eats. But she felt lonely, and always wished very much to go back to her little house and make her dumplings. And one day, when the Oni were all out somewhere, she thought she would try to run away. She first took the magic paddle and slipped it into her girdle, and then she went down to the river. No one saw her, and the boat was there. She got into it and pushed off, and, as she could row very well, she was soon far away from the shore. But the river was very wide, and she had not rowed more than 1/4 of the way across, when the Oni, all of them, came back to the house. They found that their cook was gone, and the magic paddle too. They ran down to the river at once, and saw the old woman rowing away very fast. Perhaps they could not swim. At all events, they had no boat, and they thought the only way they could catch the funny old woman would be to drink up all the water in the river before she got to the other bank. So they knelt down and began to drink so fast that, before the old woman had got halfway over, the water had become quite low. But the old woman kept on rowing until the water had got so shallow that the Oni stopped drinking and began to wade across. Then she dropped her oar, took the magic paddle from her girdle, and shook it at the Oni, and made such funny faces that the Oni all burst out laughing. But the moment they laughed, all the water came up that they had drunk, and so the river became full again, the Oni could not cross, and the funny old woman got safely over to the other side, and ran away up the road as fast as she could. She never stopped running until she found herself at home again. After that she was very happy, for she could make dumplings whenever she pleased. Besides, she had the magic paddle to make rice for her. She sold her dumplings to her neighbors and passengers, and in quite a short time she became rich. End of chapter 133. The Old Woman Who Lost Her Dumplings. Chapter 134 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 134. The Three Goats. Once upon a time there were 3 goats that were sent to some pasture lands in order to be fattened, and all 3 happened to be named Brasswind. On their road to pasture there was a bridge across a river which they must pass, and under the bridge lived a gigantic and horrible spirit, whose eyes were as large as 2 pewter plates, and whose nose was as long as the handle of a hoe. The youngest goat, Brasswind, first came along and stepped upon the bridge. "Creak, creak," complained the bridge. "Oh, it is only the smallest of the goats named Brasswind," said the goat in a very shrill voice. "Then I shall come and fetch you," cried the elf. "Nay, do not come for me, for I am still so little," said the goat. "Wait a bit till the second Brasswind comes, for he is much larger than I am." "Very well," quoth the elf. After a while the other goat Brasswind came along, and he began to go over the bridge. "Creak, creak," cried the bridge again. "Who is trampling on my bridge?" cried the elf. "Oh, it is only the second goat, Brasswind. I am going to the pasture lands to get a little fatter," answered the goat, but in a less soft voice than the first. "Then I shall come and fetch you," said the elf. "Nay, do not take me, but wait a bit till a large goat Brasswind comes, for he is a great deal bigger than I am." "Very well," replied the elf. It was not long before the big goat Brasswind reached the same spot. Creak, creak went the bridge as if it were going to split. "Who comes thundering over my bridge?" cried the elf. "The big goat Brasswind," said the goat in a gruff voice. "Then I shall come and fetch you," cried the elf. "Well, come if you like. I've 2 spears on my head, with which I can easily strike you dead. Yes, come if you like. With the thundering stones I'll shiver to powder your brains and your bones," replied the goat, and butting at the elf he easily broke every bone in his body, after which he threw him into the river, and followed the other goats to the pasture. And here the goats grew so very, very, very fat that they were not able to come home again, and unless they have grown thinner since, they are probably there still. End of chapter 134. The 3 Goats. Chapter 135 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 135. The Fox Turned Shepherd. There was once a farmer's wife who rode out to try to find a shepherd. She happened to meet a bear on the way, and the bear inquired whither she was going. "Oh, I'm going to hire a shepherd," answered she. "Will you take me for a shepherd?" asked the bear. "Yes," said the woman, "provided you can call the sheep properly." "Ho-o-o-y!" growled the bear. "No," said the woman on hearing this, "I can't hire you," and on she went. Soon after she met a wolf. "Where are you going?" asked the wolf. "Oh, I'm going to hire a shepherd," answered the woman. "Will you take me for a shepherd?" asked the wolf. "Yes, if you can call the sheep properly," replied the woman. "Oh!" howled the wolf. "No, I can't hire you," said the woman. A little further on she met a fox. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Oh, I'm going to hire a shepherd," answered the woman. "Will you take me for a shepherd?" asked the fox. "Yes, provided you can call the sheep properly," replied the woman. "Dill dal hollum!" cried the fox in a pretty, proper tone. "Yes, I will hire you," said the woman, and she took him for a shepherd to watch over the cattle. The first day, on driving the cattle to the meadow, the fox ate up all the goats. On the second day, he made a dainty meal upon the sheep, and on the third day it was the turn for the cows to be eaten. On returning home in the evening, the woman asked him where he had left the cattle. "Their heads are in the brook, and their bones are in the bushes," replied the fox. The farmer's wife was just then at the butter tub, busily making butter. Still, she wanted to go and see for herself how things stood. While she went to look, the fox put his head into the butter tub and drank up all the cream. When the woman came back and saw what he had done, she was so exasperated that she seized a clot of cream that still remained in the tub and flung it at the fox, so that it made a spot on his tail. And this is the reason why the fox's tail has a white tip. End of chapter 135. The Fox Turned Shepherd. Chapter 136 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chapter 136. The Seven Boys and the Monster. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Caspar, Michael, Fritz, and little Bessie were playing before their house, when presently little Hans came running toward them, and breathlessly cried, "What have I seen? What have I seen?" "What have you seen, then?" exclaimed all the children in one voice, collecting around him. "A monster! A frightful monster!" answered Hans, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You are afraid of your own shadow, fearful Hans," said Caspar mockingly. "Perhaps your neighbor's black cat has turned her fiery eyes on you again." "I am not afraid of my shadow," answered Hans angrily. "Had you only been there, your ridicule would soon have vanished. A cat is not a bit like a grasshopper, a fearful great grasshopper, on which one could ride." At this the children wondered very much, and when Hans related that he had seen the monster in the shepherd's hut in the field, that it had horns and such a voice that the whole hut trembled, they almost believed him. And little Fritz thought, "Who knows if it is not one of the rhinoceroses of which Herr Goldmann told us yesterday?" "Has this monster done you any harm?" asked little Bessie. "No," answered Hans. "When I screamed, it shrank back into its house." "Then I must go and see it," said Caspar, "and if you will all follow, I will go now." The children determined to go, but little Hans said, "I will not go unarmed." So Caspar mounted his horse stick, put on his helmet, and buckled his sabre to his side. Michael took his gun, Fritz the drum, and little Hans his lance. "You must remain at home, little Bessie," said Hans. "I won't bear the blame if the monster hurts you." "But I want to go with you," answered little Bessie, almost crying. "And if you will not take me, I will tell my mother." "Let her go, then," said Fritz. "But remember, Bessie, you must always keep 10 yards behind." Thus, having armed themselves, they took courage, and Caspar thought, "Oh, if we could only catch the monster, dead or alive! Ah, here come Peter and Frank and George. They can also go along with us, but they must take the great bean pole out of the garden, that we may be able to attack the monster at a distance." Now the little army set itself in motion. Caspar on Roho, for so his horse was named, came first as commander. Then came Hans with the spear, Fritz with the drum, Michael with the gun, and lastly Peter, Frank, and George with the pole. Little Bessie came 10 yards behind them. All were full of courage, and they sang, "The general on his horse comes first, and next the spear and drum, the soldier with his gun, and 3 armed with a beanpole come. But Bessie marches after all, that unto her no harm may fall." When they came to the little wood through which one must go in order to get to the great meadow where the shepherd's cot stands, Hans cried out all at once, his flag nearly falling from his hands, "Did you not hear a noise?" "Yes," cried all trembling, but Fritz still had courage enough to say, "Bessie must remain behind." Then they whispered to one another, "The monster, perhaps, has hidden here." But they dared not run away for fear the monster would fall on them from behind, and they resolved to lie on the ground and listen. So they lay down all apart, and presently they whispered, "Hans trembles very much." And after a long time Fritz asked, "Have you heard anything, Caspar?" "No," he said, and the other said, "No," and Frank thought perhaps it was only the wind. At this they took courage, and in order to show that they were not afraid, they sang, "O wind in the woods, whistle all day long, we'll whistle as boldly, we'll whistle as strong." And they began to whistle with all their strength against the wind. When they had come out of the woods, they saw the shepherd's hut standing quite alone. In the distance the sheep were peacefully feeding with their little bells sounding merrily along the meadows. Only an old ram saw the young band of heroes, and it ventured nearer in order to look wonderingly. But Caspar rode against it, brandishing his sword, which made the ram bleat and gallop away. "Now is the time," said Caspar. "We will first walk 3 times round the hut, with no one making any noise." "Bessie still stops behind," cried Fritz, out of the strength of his love. "Once more, I say," exclaimed Caspar loudly and forcefully, "no one must make a noise. We will now walk around, and when we are about to attack, Fritz will give the signal with his drum." So they began to walk around the hut, and they marched round much oftener than 3 times, and each time they stopped at the same place. "We cannot go around any more," said Caspar. "We must attack the monster from some place. Do you hide first behind the oak tree, one behind another, that the monster may not see you. I will step on to the wheel there and look in at the window, but mind you are all ready at the first call." As they hid themselves behind the oak, he walked slowly with drawn sword to the hut, and little Hans whispered behind the tree, "If there should be a wolf in the hut, do you remember the story of Little Red Riding Hood?" This made them very afraid, and they held on fast to one another. Only Frank dared look out to see how their captain got on. He had arrived at the hut, and having fastened his horse to a stake, he mounted the wheel in order to look through the window. But what a monster! A great bearded beast with horns sprang with a loud cry at him, and Caspar, pale as death from terror, fell back and could scarcely cry, "Help! Help! The monster!" As he called out, Franz said, "It has a beard and horns and such a voice!" And Hans, who stood next to the oak, fell back on the rest, and one after the other they fell to the ground. Fritz picked himself up first, and called to Caspar from afar, "Has he eaten you up yet, dear Caspar?" "Who?" cried Caspar, springing up. "Who?" And out of the hut sounded again the cry. It shook the door, and all fell back again. A goat came running up with playful jumps to our heroes. "Herr Gullmann's sick goat," cried out all, "which since the day before yesterday we have not seen in the schoolyard." "Did I not say so?" cried Caspar. "But, ah, fearful Hans, where is the monster?" "It must still be within," protested Hans. "You also have seen it." "We will look again," cried the enraged Caspar in anger. "But as the monster has not eaten the goat, it is no cannibal. Just come here and stand around while Hans and I go in. And do you hold the bar of the door, that the monster may not come out." All were, in spite of their former terror, become courageous, Still, Hans would willingly have gone back if he had not disliked being called Fearful Hans. He placed himself, therefore, at the door, behind Caspar, holding his banner before his eyes, and pressing it close to him. But Caspar did not remark that Hans had placed himself behind him, and Hans, on the other hand, did not see Caspar turn himself angrily and quickly round, the hut being very dark, and it so happened that he overturned Hans and fell over it. "The monster! The monster!" cried Hans, and Caspar exclaimed too, "The monster! The monster!" for each thought that it had overthrown him. With the quickness of lightning they sprang up again, in order to escape through the door, but those outside only held the bar faster with terror, and Hans and Caspar kicked with such violence against the wood that the others cried, "The monster! The monster!" But this time it was not a goat, but the spectre which every one sometimes sees and feels. This our hero Caspar very soon found out, and springing up, he stamped thrice on the ground with his foot, and seizing poor Hans by the collar, he shook him angrily and cried out in a voice nearly choking with rage, "You are a coward! You are a coward! Dear Caspar, let me go! I will not do it again!" "Hans, you are a coward!" cried Caspar, for the third time shaking him. But, as little Hans said, "I will certainly show you a monster," and as the others begged for his life, he let him loose, stamped again on the ground, and exclaimed, "Oh, I would have commanded a band of heroes! I would have caught the monster and led it in triumph home, but now it is gone, and you are the cause." But meanwhile the goat, which at first had so frightened them, approached again, and performed various playful capers to induce them to play with it. This increased Caspar's rage, who would have seized the animal and beaten it, but it ran back, and then lowered its horns, rushing against Caspar, not very softly. This excited him the more. He made a bold spring, seizing the brute by the hair, and mounted it, in order to better hold it. But lo, the goat ran wildly away with him, with mad jumps through the woods, past shrieking Bessie, away into the village, where the people pointed their fingers at him mockingly. Where did the goat stop? Caspar, while he lives, will not forget this. It easily found the way to the schoolhouse, where it had once joyfully fed, and flying to the yard where the affrighted dog tried to seize it, it rushed into the school at the principal entrance, and stood suddenly in the schoolroom, where Herr Gulman was correcting the exercises of his scholars. He heard the tremendous noise and outcry, and putting on his spectacles, he discovered all. What further happened I will omit, out of pity for Caspar, who may read this history sometime. Only this I must mention, that Herr Gulman made him read and explain on Monday morning, for a religious exercise, the history of David and Goliath, and soon after he unwillingly related the story of the 7 Swabians who allowed themselves to be conquered by a hare. And at that 7 little boys blushed very deeply. I believe, however, that 7 times 70 and 7 little boys would have blushed at this story I have just told, if it had happened to them. End of Chapter 136 of Tales of Laughter. The 7 Boys and the Monster. Chapter 137 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 137. The Story of Little Black Mingo by Helen Bannerman. Once upon a time there was a little black girl, and her name was Little Black Mingo. She had no father and mother, so she had to live with a horrid, cross old woman called Black Noggy, who used to scold her every day, and sometimes beat her with a stick, even though she had done nothing naughty. One day Black Noggy called her and said, "Take this chatty down to the river and fill it with water, and come back as fast as you can. Quick now!" So Little Black Mingo took the chatty and ran down to the river as fast as she could, and began to fill it with water. when crack, bang, a horrible big mugger poked its nose up through the bottom of the chatty and said, "Ha ha, little Mingo, I am going to eat you up." Little Black Mingo did not say anything. She turned and ran away as fast as ever she could, and the mugger ran after her. But the broken chatty around his neck caught his paws, so he could not overtake her. But when she got back to Black Noggy and told her how the mugger had broken the chatty, Black Noggy was fearfully angry. "You naughty girl," she said, "you have broken the chatty yourself. I have a good mind to beat you." And if she had not been in such a hurry for the water, she would have beaten her. Then she went and fetched the great big chatty that the dhobi used to boil the clothes in. "Take this," she said, "and mind you don't break it, or I will beat you." "But I can't carry it when it's full of water," said Little Black Mingo. "You must go twice, and bring it half full each time," said Black Noggy. So Little Black Mingo took the dhobi's great big chatty and started again to go to the river. But first she went to a little bank above the river, and peeped up and down to see if she could see the old mugger anywhere. But she could not see him, for he was hiding under the very bank she was standing on, and though his tail stuck out of the water, she never saw him at all. She would like to have run home, but she was too much afraid that Black Noggy would beat her. So Little Black Mingo crept down to the river and began filling the big chatty with water. And while she was filling it, the mugger came creeping softly behind her and caught her by the leg, saying, "Ah, Little Black Mingo, now I've got you." And Little Black Mingo said, "Oh, please don't eat me up, great big mugger." "What will you give me if I don't eat you up?" said the mugger. But Little Black Mingo was so poor she had nothing to give. So the mugger caught her in his great cruel mouth, and swam away with her to an island in the middle of the river, and set her down beside a huge pile of eggs. "Those are my eggs," he said. "Tomorrow a little mugger will come out of each, and then we will have a great feast, and we will eat you up." Then he waddled off to catch a fish for himself, and left Little Black Mingo alone beside the big pile of eggs. And Little Black Mingo sat down on a big stone and hid her face in her hands, and cried bitterly, because she couldn't swim, and she didn't know how to get away. Presently she heard a queer little squeaking noise that sounded like squeak, squeak, squeak. "Oh, Little Black Mingo, help me, or I shall be drowned." She got up and looked to see what was calling, and she saw a bush come floating down the river with something wriggling and scrambling about in it, and as it came near she saw that it was a mongoose that was in the bush. So she waded out as far as she could and caught hold of the bush and pulled it in, and the poor mongoose crawled up her arm to her shoulder, and she carried him to shore. When they got to shore the mongoose shook himself, and Little Black Mingo wrung out her petticoat, and so they both very soon got dry. The mongoose then began to poke around for something to eat, and very soon he found the great pile of mugger's eggs. "Oh, joy!" said he. "What's this?" "Those are the mugger's eggs," said Little Black Mingo. "I'm not afraid of muggers," said the mongoose, and he sat down and began to crack the eggs and eat the little muggers as they came out, and he threw the shells into the water, so that the old mugger could not see that anyone had been eating them. But he was careless, and he left one eggshell on the edge, and he was hungry, and he ate so many that the pile got much smaller, and when the old mugger came back he saw at once that someone had been meddling with them. So he ran to Little Black Mingo and said, "How dare you eat my eggs?" "Indeed, indeed, I didn't," said Little Black Mingo. "Then who could it have been?" said the mugger, and he ran back to the eggs as fast as he could, and, sure enough, when he got back he found the mongoose had eaten a whole lot more. Then he said to himself, "I must stay beside my eggs until they are hatched into little muggers, or the mongoose will eat them all." So he curled himself into a ring around the eggs and went to sleep. But while he was asleep the mongoose came to eat some more eggs, and ate as many as he wanted, and when the mugger woke this time, oh, what a rage he was in! for there were only 6 eggs left. He roared so loud that all the little muggers inside the shells gnashed their teeth and tried to roar too. Then he said, "I know what I'll do. I'll fetch little black Mingo's big chatty and cover my eggs with that. Then the mongoose won't be able to get at them." So he swam across to the shore and fetched the dhobi's big chatty and covered the eggs with it. "Now, you wicked little mongoose, come and eat my eggs if you can," he said, and he went off quite proud and happy. By and by the mongoose came back, and he was terribly disappointed when he found the eggs were all covered with the big chatty. So he ran off to little black Mingo and asked her to help him, and little black Mingo came and took the big chatty off the eggs, and the mongoose ate them, every one. "Now," he said, "there will be no little muggers to make a feast for tomorrow." "No," said little black Mingo, "but the mugger will eat me all by myself, I'm afraid." "No, he won't," said the mongoose, "for we will sail away together in the big chatty before he comes back." So he climbed onto the edge of the chatty, and little black Mingo pushed the chatty out into the water, and then she clambered into it and paddled with her 2 hands as hard as she could, and the big chatty just sailed beautifully. So they got across safely, and little black Mingo filled the chatty half full of water and took it on her head, and they went up the bank together. When the mugger came back and found only empty eggshells, he was fearfully angry. He roared and he raged and he howled and he yelled till the whole island shook, and his tears ran down his cheeks and pattered on the sand like rain. So he started to chase little black Mingo and the mongoose, and he swam across the river as fast as he could. And when he was halfway across, he saw them landing, and as he landed they hurried over the first ridge. So he raced after them, but they ran, and just before he caught them, they got into the house and banged the door in his face. Then they shut all the windows, so he could not get in anywhere. "All right," he said, "you will have to come out sometime, and then I'll catch you both and eat you up." So he hid behind the back of the house and waited. Now Black Noggy was just coming home from the bazaar with a tin of kerosene on her head and a box of matches in her hand, and when he saw her, the mugger rushed out and gobbled her up, kerosene tin, matches, and all. When Black Noggy found herself in the mugger's insides, she wanted to see where she was, so she felt for the matchbox and took out a match and lit it. But the mugger's teeth had made holes in the kerosene tin, so that the flame of the match caught the kerosene, and bang! The kerosene exploded, and blew the old mugger and Black Noggy into little bits. At the fearful noise, little black Mingo and the mongoose came running out, and there they found Black Noggy and the old mugger all blown to bits. So little black Mingo and the mongoose got a nice little house for their very own, and there they lived happily ever after. And little black Mingo got the mugger's head for her seat, and the mongoose got Black Noggy's handkerchief for his, but he was so wee that he used to put it on the mugger's nose, and there they sat and had their tea every evening. End of chapter 137 of Tales of Laughter. Chapter 138 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chapter 138. The Cock and the Crested Hen. There was once a cock who had a whole farmyard full of hens to look after and manage, and among them was a tiny little crested hen. She thought she was altogether too grand to be in the company with the other hens, for they looked so old and shabby. She wanted to go out and strut about all by herself so that people could see how fine she was and admire her pretty crest and beautiful plumage. So one day, when all the hens were strutting about on the dust heap and showing themselves off, and picking and clucking as they were wont to do, this desire seized her, and she began to cry. cluck, 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 over the fence, cluck, 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 over the fence, and wanted to get away. The cock stretched his neck and shook his comb and feathers and cried, "Go not there!" And all the old hens cackled, "Go, go, go, go not there!" But she set off for all of that, and was not a little proud when she got away, and could go about pluming and showing herself off quite alone. Just then a hawk began to fly around in a circle above her, and all of a sudden he swooped down upon her. The cock, as he stood on the top of the dust heap, stretching his neck and peering first with one eye and then with the other, had long noticed him, and cried with all his might, "Come, come, come, come and help! Come, come, come and help!" till the people came running to see what was the matter. They frightened the hawk, so he let go the hen, and had to be satisfied with her tuft and her finest feathers, which he had plucked from her. And then, you may be sure, she lost no time in running home. She stretched her neck and tripped along, crying, "See, see, see, see how I look! See, 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 see how I look!" The cock came up to her in his dignified way, drooping one of his wings, and said, "Didn't I tell you?" From that time the hen did not consider herself too good to be in the company of the old hens on the dust heap. End of chapter 138. The Cock and the Crested Hen. Chapter 139 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Dale Grothmann. Chapter 139 of Tales of Laughter by Kate Douglas Wiggin and Nora Archibald Smith. The Old Woman and the Fish. There was once upon a time an old woman who lived in a miserable cottage on the brow of a hill overlooking the town. Her husband had been dead for many years, and her children were in service round about the parish, so she felt rather lonely and dreary by herself, and otherwise she was not particularly well off either. But when it has been ordained that one shall live, one cannot think of one's funeral, and so one has to take the world as it is, and still be satisfied. That was about all the old woman could console herself with, but that the road up which she had to carry the pails from the well should be so heavy, and that the axe should have a blunt and rusty edge, so that it was only with greatest difficulty that she could cut the little firewood she had, and that the stuff she was weaving was not sufficient. All this grieved her greatly, and caused her to complain from time to time. One day, when she had pulled the bucket up from the well, she happened to find a small pike in the bucket, which did not at all displease her. "Such a fish does not come into my pot every day," she said, and now she could have a really grand dish, she thought. But the fish that she had got this time was no fool, and it had the gift of speech, that it had. "Let me go," said the fish. The old woman began to stare, you might be sure. Such a fish she had never before seen in this world. "Are you so much than other fish, then," she said, "and too good to be eaten?" "Wise is he who does not eat all that he gets hold of," said the fish. "Only let me go, and you shall not remain without reward for your trouble." "I like a fish in a bucket better than all those frisking about free and frolicsome in the lakes," said the old woman. "And that one can catch with one hand, one can also carry with one's mouth," she said. "That may be," said the fish, "but if you do as I tell you, you shall have 3 wishes." "Wish in one fist and pour water in the other, and you'll soon see which you will get filled first," said the woman. "Promises are well enough, but keeping them is better, and I shan't believe much in you till I have got you in the pot," she said. "You should mind that tongue of yours," said the fish, "and listen to my words. Wish for 3 things, and then you'll see what will happen," he said. Well, the old woman knew well enough what she wanted to wish, and there might not be so much danger in trying how far the fish would keep his word, she thought. She then began thinking of the heavy hill up from the well. I would wish that the pails could go of themselves to the well and home again, she said. So they shall, said the fish. Then she thought of the axe and how blunt it was. I would wish that whatever I strike shall break right off, she said. So it shall, said the fish. Then she remembered that the stuff she was weaving was not long enough. I would wish that whatever I pull shall become long, she said. That it shall, said the fish. And now let me down into the well again. Yes, that she would, and all at once the pails began to scramble up the hill. Dear me, did you ever see anything like it? The old woman became so glad and pleased that she slapped herself across the knees. Crack, crack, it sounded, and then both her legs fell off, and she was left sitting on the top of the lid over the well. Now came a change. She began to cry and wail, and the tears started from her eyes, whereupon she started to blow her nose with her apron, and as she tugged at her nose, it grew so long, that it was terrible to see. That is what she got for her wishes. Well, there she sat, and there she no doubt still sits, on the lid of the well. And if you want to know what it is like to have a long nose, you had better go there and ask her, for she can tell you all about it. She can. End of chapter 139 of Tales of Laughter, The Old Woman and the Fish. Chapter 140 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. The Lad and the Fox. There was once upon a time a little lad who was on his way to church, and when he came to a clearing in the forest he caught sight of a fox that was lying on top of a big stone, so fast asleep that he did not know the lad had seen him. If I kill that fox, said the lad, taking a heavy stone in his fist, and sell the skin, I shall get money for it, and with that money I shall buy some rye, and that rye I shall sow in my father's cornfield at home. When the people who are on their way to church pass by my field of rye, they'll say, "Oh, what splendid rye that lad has got!" Then I shall say to them, "I say, keep away from my rye." But they won't heed me. Then I shall shout at them, "I say, keep away from my rye." But still they won't take any notice of me. Then I shall scream with all my might, "Keep away from my rye." And then they'll listen to me. But the lad screamed so loudly that the fox woke up and made off at once for the forest, so that the lad did not even get as much as a handful of his hair. No, it's always best to take what you can reach, for the undone deeds you should never screech, as the saying goes. The end of The Lad and the Fox. Chapter 141 of Tales of Laughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas WIGGIN. Chapter 141. The Old Woman and the Tramp. There was once a tramp who went plodding his way through the forest. The distance between the houses was so great that he had little hope of finding shelter before the night set in. But all of a sudden he saw some lights between the trees. He then discovered a cottage where there was a fire burning on the hearth. How nice it would be to roast oneself before that fire, and to get a bite of something, he thought. So he dragged himself toward the cottage. Just then an old woman came toward him. "Good evening, and well met," said the tramp. "Good evening," said the woman. "Where do you come from?" "South of the sun and east of the moon," said the tramp. "And now I am on the way home again, for I have been all over the world with the exception of this parish," he said. "You must be a great traveler then," said the woman. "What may be your business here?" "Oh, I want shelter for the night," he said. "I thought as much," said the woman. "But you may as well get away from here at once, for my husband is not home, and my place is not an inn," she said. "My good woman," said the tramp, "you must not be so cross and hard-hearted, for we are both human beings and should help one another, as it is written." "Help one another," said the woman. "Help! Did you ever hear such a thing? Who'll help me, do you think? I haven't a morsel in the house. No, you'll have to look for quarters elsewhere," she said. But the tramp was like the rest of his kind, and he did not consider himself beaten by the first rebuff. Although the old woman grumbled and complained as much as she could, he was just as persistent as ever, and went on begging and praying like a starved dog, until at last she gave in, and he got permission to lie on the floor for the night. That was very kind, he thought, and he thanked her for it. Better on the floor without sleep than suffering cold in the forest deep, he said, for he was a merry fellow, this tramp, and always ready with a rhyme. When he came into the room, he could see that the woman was not so badly off as she had pretended, but she was a greedy and stingy woman of the worst sort, and always complaining and grumbling. He now made himself very agreeable, of course, and asked her in his most insinuating manner for something to eat. "Where am I going to get it from?" said the woman. "I haven't tasted a morsel myself the whole day." But the tramp was a cunning fellow, he was. "Poor old granny, you must be starving," he said. "Well, well, I suppose I will have to ask you to have something with me then." "Have something with you," said the woman. "You don't look as if you could ask anybody to have anything. What have you got to offer one, I should like to know?" "He who far and wide does roam sees many things not known at home, and he who many things has seen has wits about him and senses keen," said the tramp. "Better dead than to lose one's head. Lend me a pot, granny." The old woman now became very inquisitive, as you may have guessed, so she let him have a pot. He filled it with water and put it on the fire, and then he blew with all his might until the fire was burning fiercely all around it. Then he took a 4-inch nail from his pocket, turned it 3 times in his hand, and put it into the pot. The woman stared with all her might. "What's this going to be?" she asked. "Nail broth," said the tramp, and began to stir the water with a porridge stick. "Nail broth?" asked the woman. "Yes, nail broth," said the tramp. The old woman had seen and heard a good deal in her time, but that anybody could make broth with a nail, well, she had never heard the like before. "That's something for poor people to know," she said, "and I should like to learn how to make it." "That which is not worth having will always go a-begging," said the tramp. But if she wanted to learn how to make it, she had only to watch him, he said, and went on stirring the broth. The old woman squatted on the ground, her hands clasping her knee, and her eyes following his hand as he stirred the broth. "This generally makes good broth," he said, "but this time it will very likely be rather thin, for I have been making broth the whole week with this same nail. If one only had a handful of sifted oatmeal to put in, that would make it all right," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about," and so he stirred the broth again. "Well, I think I have a scrap of flour somewhere," said the old woman, and went out to fetch some, and it was both good and fine. The tramp began to put the flour into the broth and went on stirring, while the woman sat staring now at him and then at the pot, until her eyes nearly burst their sockets. "This broth would be good enough for company," he said, putting in one handful of flour after another. "If I only had a bit of salted beef and a few potatoes to put in it, it would be fit for gentlefolk, however particular they might be," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." When the old woman really began to think it over, she thought she had some potatoes, and perhaps a bit of beef as well, and these she gave the tramp, who went on stirring, while she sat and stared as hard as ever. "This will be grand enough for the best in the land," he said. "Well, I never! And just fancy, all with a nail!" He was really a wonderful man, that tramp. He could do more than drink a sup and turn the tankard up, he could. "If one only had a little barley and a drop of milk, I could ask the king himself to have some of it," he said. "For this is what he has every blessed evening. That I know, for I have been in service under the king's cook," he said. "Dear me! Ask the king to have some! Well, I never!" exclaimed the woman, slapping her knees. She was quite awestruck at the tramp and his grand connections. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about," said the tramp. And then she remembered she had a little barley, and as for milk, well, she wasn't quite out of that, she said, for her best cow had just calved, and then she went out to fetch both one and the other. The tramp went on stirring, and the woman sat staring, one moment at him, and the next at the pot. Then all at once the tramp took out the nail. "Now it's ready, and now we'll have a good feast," he said. "But to this kind of soup the king and queen always take a dram or two, and one sandwich at least. And then they always have a cloth on the table when they eat," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." But by this time the old woman herself had begun to feel quite grand and fine, I can tell you. And if that was all that was wanted to make it just as the king had it, she thought it would be nice to have it exactly the same way for once, and to play at being king and queen with the tramp. She went straight to a cupboard and brought out the brandy bottle, dram glasses, butter and cheese, smoked beef and veal, until at last the table looked as if it were decked out for company. Never in her life had the old woman had such a grand feast, and never had she tasted such broth. And just fancy, made only with a nail. She was in such a good and merry humor at having learned such an economical way of making broth that she did not know how to make enough of the tramp who had taught her such a useful thing. So they ate and drank and ate, until they both became tired and sleepy. The tramp was now going to lie down on the floor. But that would not do, thought the old woman. No, that is impossible. "Such a grand person must have a bed to lie in," she said. He did not need much pressing. "It's just like sweet Christmas time," he said, "and a nicer woman I have never come across. Ah, well, happy are they who meet with such good people," he said, and he lay down on the bed and went to sleep. The next morning when he awoke, the first thing he got was coffee and a dram. When he was going, the old woman gave him a bright dollar piece. "And thanks, many thanks for what you have taught me," she said. "Now I shall live in comfort, since I have learned how to make broth with a nail." "Well, it isn't very difficult if one has something good to add to it," said the tramp as he went his way. The woman stood at the door staring after him. "Such nice people don't grow on every bush," she said. End of chapter 141, The Old Woman and the Tramp. End of Tales of Laughter by Nora Archibald Smith and Kate Douglas Wiggin.